Italy, the very heart of the Roman Empire, the place where power, culture, and influence once shaped the known world. But what if the story of the gospel in Italy is not what most people assume? What if it didn't begin with institutions, traditions, or authority, but with something far more fragile and far more powerful? Before cathedrals, before systems, before centuries of religious structure, there was a message carried not by kings or armies, but by ordinary people. People who believed they had encountered something real, something that changed everything. This message entered Italy not through dominance, but through tension, not through acceptance, but through resistance. It grew in the shadows of an empire that would eventually try to control it and reshape it. So how did the gospel of Jesus actually reach Italy? What did it look like in the beginning? And what happened along the way? Because what you're about to see is not just history. It's a journey of survival, distortion, courage, and rediscovery. So subscribe, because this trail is just beginning. What happens when the message of Jesus enters the most powerful empire in the world? In the first century, Rome was not just a city. It was the center of everything. Politics, military power, philosophy, culture, everything flowed through it. And into this environment, the gospel arrived, not with force, but with quiet conviction. One of the most significant moments in this story is connected to the Apostle Paul. Unlike many others, Paul didn't just pass through regions. He aimed directly for Rome. In Acts and in his letters, we see his determination to bring the message of Christ to the very heart of the empire. And eventually he did, not as a free man, but as a prisoner. Imagine that contrast. The gospel entering Rome, not through a position of power, but through chains. And yet, even in that condition, Paul continued to preach, teach, and influence those around him. Roman guards, citizens, and even members of Caesar's household were exposed to the message. But Paul was not alone. Early Christian tradition also points to Peter being present in Rome, contributing to the growth of the early church. Whether through apostles, converts, or travelers, the message began to spread, slowly but steadily. Small communities of believers formed across the city. They didn't gather in grand buildings. They met in homes, in hidden places, in environments where their faith could be expressed without drawing too much attention. Because here's the reality. This message was not welcomed by everyone. Christians in Rome often faced suspicion. Their beliefs challenged cultural norms. Their loyalty to Christ stood apart from imperial expectations, and their gatherings were misunderstood. This created pressure, sometimes subtle, sometimes intense. And yet, the gospel continued to grow. One of the most powerful realities of this period is that the message didn't spread because it was safe. It spread because it was true. People were willing to risk comfort, reputation, and even security because they believed in what they had found. The church in Italy was not built on convenience. It was built on conviction. Subscribe. This trail is just beginning. But then, something shifted. What began as a movement of personal faith slowly became something else. As Christianity gained recognition and eventually acceptance within the Roman Empire, its relationship with power began to change. At first, this seemed like a victory. The message that was once marginalized was now being acknowledged. Over time, Christianity moved from the edges of society to the center of influence. But here's the question. What happens when a message built on humility becomes connected to power? As centuries passed, Christianity in Italy became increasingly institutionalized. Structures were formed. Authority was defined. Systems were established to organize belief, practice, and leadership. And while this brought order and expansion, it also created distance. The simplicity of the gospel, the direct, personal connection with Christ, began to be overshadowed by external expressions of religion. Rituals became central. Hierarchies became stronger. And for many people, faith became something they participated in, rather than something they personally lived. Another key factor was access to Scripture. The Bible was not widely available to the common people, and when it was often in Latin, a language most could not understand. This created a dependency on interpretation rather than personal discovery. But even in this environment, something deeper was happening. There were individuals who began to sense that something was missing, not necessarily rejecting everything, but feeling that the core of the message had become distant, that the original simplicity of the gospel had been overshadowed. This tension didn't explode immediately. It grew slowly, quietly, beneath the surface. And that's what makes the next phase of the story so important. Because what starts as a question often becomes a movement. But this was only the first step. The trail goes deeper. But what happens when questions refuse to stay silent? As the tension beneath the surface continued to grow, Italy entered a period of intellectual awakening, the Renaissance. Art, philosophy, and human thought began to flourish again. But along with this revival came something else, the courage to question, and not just art or culture, but faith itself. Some began to look back at the scriptures with fresh eyes, not through layers of tradition, but with a desire to understand the original message. And as they did, they started to notice something. There was a gap between what they read and what they saw around them. One of the most compelling examples is the Waldensians. Although they began earlier and outside of Italy's central power structures, many of their communities existed in northern Italy. They emphasized a simple, scripture-centered faith long before the Reformation officially began. They believed the Bible should be accessible, lived and understood by ordinary people. And because of that, they faced pressure. Not always loudly, not always visibly, but consistently enough to force them into difficult choices. Some withdrew into more isolated regions. Others continued quietly, preserving what they believed mattered most. Then came the broader wave of the Reformation across Europe. While figures like Luther and Calvin were shaping movements elsewhere, their ideas began to reach Italy, sometimes through books, sometimes through travelers, sometimes through whispers. Italian thinkers like Girolamo Savonarola also played a role in stirring spiritual awareness. While not a reformer in the same sense as those who came later, his call for moral and spiritual renewal revealed something important. There was already a deep dissatisfaction with the state of faith. But here's the tension. Italy was not a place where these ideas could spread freely. Those who embraced reform often faced resistance, limitation, and in many cases, had to leave the country to continue their work. The movement didn't explode in Italy the way it did in other parts of Europe, but that doesn't mean it failed. Because the purpose of this phase was not visibility, it was preservation. The gospel was being rediscovered again. piece by piece, through people who refused to ignore what they had seen. And once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. So what happens after centuries of tension, control, and quiet resistance? Something begins to shift. As Europe moved into more modern periods, political and social structures started to change. The tight grip that once controlled access to belief gradually loosened. Freedom, though not immediate or perfect, began to open doors that had long been closed. And with that, the gospel began to surface again. Not as a dominant force, not as a cultural system, but as a personal reality. Evangelical movements started to emerge in Italy, often influenced by missionaries, translated scriptures, and returning ideas that had once been suppressed. These communities were small at first, sometimes overlooked, sometimes misunderstood, but they carried something powerful: clarity. For many, this was the first time the Bible was not just heard, but understood. The message of grace, of salvation through Christ alone, of a direct relationship with God, these ideas began to resonate deeply with those who encountered them. Today, Italy remains a country shaped by deep historical tradition. But within that landscape, something continues to grow. Evangelical churches, though still a minority, are present across the nation. According to recent estimates, there are hundreds of thousands of evangelicals in Italy, with communities continuing to expand. And here's what makes this moment so significant. The gospel in Italy is no longer hidden in the same way it once was. It is accessible, it is available, and yet it still requires the same thing it always did: decision. Because in every generation, the message must be rediscovered personally. What began in the heart of the Roman Empire is still echoing today. When you look at the story as a whole, one thing becomes clear. The gospel of Jesus Christ did not simply arrive in Italy and remain unchanged. It moved through phases. It was carried by ordinary people, challenged by powerful systems, reshaped by history, and rediscovered by those who refused to settle for distance. From the moment it entered Rome through apostles like Paul, to the formation of early Christian communities, to the rise of institutional control, and later to the quiet but persistent voices of reform. The journey was never simple. It was marked by tension, by struggle, and by moments where it seemed like the original message could be lost. But it never was. Because the gospel was never dependent on a system to survive. It was never confined to a structure, a language, or a time period. It continued through people, through those who sought truth, who questioned, who endured, and who chose to believe even when it wasn't easy. And today that same message still exists in Italy. Not just as part of history, not just as tradition, but as something living, something active, something that still reaches individuals in a personal way. So the question is no longer how the gospel reached Italy. The question is, what will you do with it now? So subscribe, and remember, the trail doesn't end here. Share this story. There are more nations, more histories, and more hidden journeys waiting to be uncovered. Gracias por acompañarnos en este recorrido por la historia del cristianismo en este país. Que Dios te bendiga y nos vemos en el próximo episodio.